The difficulty in cutting spending from a government's budget is that once you get rid of those benefits, the people who rely on them will start to get angry. And this is exactly what is happening in Australia. But it gets better. In contrast to the American political scheme, the party that is trying to cut spending in Australia is actually called the Liberal Party of Australia. But rest assured, Prime Minister Tony Abbott's plan is to fix the ailing budget crisis within the country. This is usually the point when the Australian frontbenchers in Parliament start to stand up and yell at each other. With good reason. On May 13th, when the Australian Treasury Department released their budget plan, it included huge tax hikes and budget cuts that many in the country are calling austerity measures. But Prime Minister Abbott says that these are all required measures to help absolve the country of the budget crisis that they inherited from the last party, the Labour Party. He says that these measures will help take a swing at Australia's huge government debt, especially as a percentage of its gross domestic product, which the Organization for Economic Collaboration and Development, in its 2013 report, shows to be about 34% of the country's gross domestic product, as compared to the 104% government debt to GDP in the United States, and nearly 227% in Japan. Clearly, Australia's government debt crisis is one to be envied by other developed nations. But wait a minute. Did Tony Abbott just invent a budget crisis? The answer is yes. What Tony Abbott is actually referring to is a plan to return a budget surplus. But the actual condition of the budget with relation to the economy is not a dire crisis. First of all, because it doesn't take into account the greater economic factors at play. And second, because this is all part of an ongoing political feud. But the first aspect to take into consideration when we see that Tony Abbott has actually invented a budget crisis is that the analysis being produced on the financial level does not match up to broader economic factors. First of all, the government's growth in spending actually aligned with the growth of the economy. And second, any decrease in productivity can be attributed to fluctuations in trade. But first of all, the factors at play have to do with the growth of the economy and the growth of inflation, something that many economic and financial experts within the Liberal Party's administration feel is discomforting. Inflation is when the value of the currency rises without an actual change in the value that the country has to back those in terms of resources. And for many countries, this is bad on an economic scale because an increased inflated currency makes their products seem more valuable than they actually are. And what the discomforting fact that the Australians are trying to push away from is brought up by an article published by the University of Canberra on May 30th. This Australian university shows that Australia's inflation rate is approximately 2.5% over the last year, which normally would be a fact of concern. But what's actually going on is that that statistic is aligning with the overall growth of the Australian economy. How do we know? An Organization for Economic Collaboration and Development report from 2014 shows that the Australian gross domestic product has grown by more than 3.6%, more than enough to factor in the aspects of inflation that are being cited here. But the other piece that the Tony Abbott budget is trying to work against and struggling to meet a problem that doesn't actually exist has to do with decreased productivity. And this mainly has to do with the key sector that has allowed for nearly uninterrupted growth over the last 22 years in Australia. Its mining industry. Despite this, a Wall Street Journal article from May 17th shows that the mining returns have actually fallen over the last few months within Australia. And this is all part of what Tony Abbott's government is trying to play off as an inherited budget problem, one that expends too many entitlements and benefits to the country's citizens rather than actually working towards creating a stronger business climate. But instead, the problem at fault doesn't have to do with the economic factors for productivity, but instead the fact that China is trying to wean itself off of coal and other mineral resources, and as a result is just trading less with Australia. Despite this, the May 13th budget report shows that the Australian Treasury is pushing forward with drastic measures to raise the retirement age in Australia to 70 by 2035. But this is a rather fallacious proposal, as it's likely that these normal swings of the economy and trade can be changed within the next 20 years. But that's not what the Abbott budget is doing. And in this way, it's pushing away from key economic factors. The second piece that we have to understand is that this budget crisis that the Abbott government seems to have fabricated is all part of a growing political feud. First of all, it has to do with returning the government budget to a surplus. But second, it's simply an attack on the means of the Labour Party's last government. The main factor at hand here is a political battle between the Liberal Party and the Labour Party. The Labour Party, which puts a greater amount of weight on spending as a means of achieving public and growth within the lives of the citizens, has come under fire from the Liberal Party because it is seen as wasteful. But those tables were turned in January of 2013, when a landmark report by the International Monetary Fund showed that the Labour governments of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard were not actually wasteful. In fact, their spending contributed to the stability of the economy. Instead, the only Australian Prime Minister that the IMF describes as wasteful was John Howard, the last Liberal Prime Minister. This is a problem that is difficult for the Australian government in power right now to push off. In correspondence, an article from The Australian on May 25th shows that they are trying to bring Australia back to a budget surplus, with no debt and instead a surplus of spending, to try and put the Labour Party to shame. But all that has to do is the second part of the political feud, the fact that the Labour Party is now being attacked for its means, not its ends. A Guardian article from June 3rd points at a particularly troubling political fact, that the Labour Party governments have espoused ideals that the people of Australia generally seem to like, having more secure jobs, secure pensions, and lower pollution. But because the Liberal Party cannot gain traction on fighting those issues, most Australians like those, it must attack the means by which the Labour Party is seeking to do them. And that involves attacking taxes, putting more on, and cutting public spending to try and eliminate the debt problem that they perceive of having been created. This is why, in a Sydney Morning Herald announcement from June 4th, Treasury Secretary John Hockey persists that he will not leave the children of Australia with any debt. But when we return to the question, did Tony Abbott just fabricate a debt crisis? The answer becomes clear that he did, for economic and political factors that are now being used to try and turn an inherited problem against the Labour Department and its government from the past few years. While this may be a way to push Australia to a budget surplus, it may not be the most healthy for the economy, and it may not even be a successful political gambit for the Liberal Party.